Before Princess Diana, no one in the royal family was as beloved as the Queen Mum. Yet, the same papers that called her the beloved grandmother of the nation never quite explained why Wallis Simpson was reduced, in repeated accounts, to that woman, or why two of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's nieces sat in a Surrey institution while Burke's Peerage listed them as dead. When the Queen Mother died on 30 March 2002, she was 101 years old. About 200,000 people filed past her coffin during 3 days at Westminster Hall. More than 1 million were reported to have lined the route to Windsor for her funeral on 9 April. Around 10 million people watched on British television. That response was real. Production note: accessible archival visual proof includes the 1937 letters patent, Burke's Peerage entries, Imperial War Museums wartime photographs and material, funeral footage, and relevant published correspondence. A 2001 Ipsos MORI poll found that roughly 1 in 5 respondents named her among the royals they liked most, with support spread across age groups. At a time when scandals had damaged other members of the family, she seemed almost untouchable, the woman in pastel coats, broad hats, and a smile that survived war, widowhood, and a century of public duty. The Times, quoted in a 1980 piece, reportedly considered her probably the most popular royal personage of all time. The Canadian Encyclopedia described her as, by far the most popular, member of the House of Windsor, noting she had been called a Queen of Hearts before Diana ever arrived. The sharper reassessment came largely after her death. It grew from the records beneath the photographs, a title withheld, names missing from family books, a former governess cut off, a household spending beyond its means, and a royal culture that confused silence with dignity for so long that television eventually exposed the difference. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was neither a simple monster nor a harmless national granny. She was the last great practitioner of a monarchy built on charm, reserve, hierarchy, and selective access. Her wartime courage was genuine. So was the private system of exclusion that operated around her. She was born on 4 August 1900 at St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon and Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck. Her father later became the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Glamis Castle in Angus was the family seat, but it wasn't her birthplace. The distinction matters because the Queen Mother myth often begins at Glamis. Tartan, towers, dogs, ponies, and a supposedly uncomplicated Scottish childhood. Her actual upbringing was more revealing. She belonged to one of Britain's old landed families, with multiple homes, private tutors, governesses, servants, and royal connections. The family had estates at St. Paul's Waldenbury, Glamis, and Streatham Castle in County Durham. She learned French, literature, scripture, geography, mathematics, and history. At about 13, she passed the Oxford local examination with distinction, surprising teachers who found her precocious enough to open an essay with 2 Greek words from Xenophon's Anabasis. Her childhood was privileged, but it wasn't protected from war. When Britain entered the First World War in August 1914, Elizabeth was 14. Glamis became a hospital and convalescent home for wounded soldiers. She wrote letters for men who couldn't write, brought them tobacco, played cards, and helped with welfare work. She was never a trained nurse, but she saw the injuries of the Western Front arrive inside her family home. 4 of her brothers served. One, Michael, was reported missing, then discovered a prisoner of war. Another was invalided out after being wounded. The castle caught fire in 1916. Elizabeth helped organize the rescue of its contents. On 27 September 1915, her brother, Captain Fergus Bowes-Lyon of the Black Watch, was killed at the Battle of Lewes. He was 26. He had visited Glamis only weeks before, meeting the daughter his wife had given birth to 2 months earlier. He never came home. The family's grief was private and sustained. It shaped Elizabeth's understanding of what composure required. 8 years later, on 26 April 1923, she walked into Westminster Abbey to marry Prince Albert, Duke of York. Before she reached the altar, she stepped away from her father's arm and laid her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior. The gesture became a royal tradition. Later brides left their bouquets there after their ceremonies. But Elizabeth's was first, and it was linked to Fergus and to a generation of men who had not returned. The bouquet was reportedly made of white York roses and heather. That small act explains something essential about her public appeal. She could turn private discipline into a national symbol. The bouquet was grief, but it was also control. A personal wound presented in a form the whole country could understand. Albert had pursued her for 2 years. He proposed in February 1921, and she refused. A letter attributed to her gives the reason plainly. She feared she would never, never again be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. She refused again in 1922, when Albert proposed for a second time on the occasion of his sister Princess Mary's wedding, where Elizabeth served as bridesmaid. He proposed a third time in January 1923, and she accepted. The marriage wasn't a fairy tale imposed on an eager, aristocratic bride. Elizabeth understood exactly what royalty could cost. Albert was shy, prone to a severe stammer that made public speaking painful, and unlikely to become king. He was the second son of George V. She expected a supporting role. After 1925, she helped him through speech therapy devised by Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist whose methods eventually worked well enough for Albert to address the nation. Elizabeth sat in on sessions, helped with exercises, and gave Albert a domestic life stable enough to survive the anxiety the speeches caused him. She wasn't simply patient, she was essential. Then Edward VIII chose Wallis Simpson. Edward became king on 20th of January 1936, after George V died. By October, Wallis Simpson had received a preliminary divorce decree from her second husband, Ernest Simpson. Edward wanted to marry her. The problem was constitutional as well as social. He was king, head of the Church of England, and proposed to marry a twice-divorced American woman whose former husbands were still alive. The British government opposed it. The Church opposed it. The Dominions opposed it. The British press had largely kept the affair quiet until the crisis could no longer be concealed. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin warned the king that the British public wouldn't accept a twice-divorced American woman as their queen. On 10th December 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The next night, he broadcast from Windsor Castle, stage-managed by BBC Director General Sir John Reith himself. He said he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love. He had reigned for 325 days and was never crowned. His brother Albert inherited that burden. George VI didn't want the throne. In his diary, after telling his mother, Queen Mary, that he would become king, he wrote that he broke down and sobbed like a child. He had a stammer. He was deeply private. He had spent his adult life preparing to support a king, not to become one. Elizabeth became queen consort on 11th December 1936. Their coronation followed at Westminster Abbey on 12th May 1937, the date previously scheduled for Edward VIII's coronation. Elizabeth's crown was made of platinum and set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond. For her, the abdication wasn't an abstract constitutional episode. It was the event that transformed her husband's life, put their daughters at the center of the monarchy, and tied her future to a role she had once feared would take away her freedom. She is reported to have later described the abdication as a terrible tragedy, and believed Edward had been bemused by love. Later biographical accounts say she told Prince Charles she could never forgive Edward for what he had done to George VI. Elizabeth believed the strain of the crown had shortened her husband's life. George VI died in 1952, aged 56, after lung cancer and a lifetime of heavy smoking. That is the medical record, but Elizabeth's conviction about the cause didn't require the medical evidence to be wrong. A woman who had once been afraid of losing her freedom now watched her shy, stammering husband carry the weight of a throne he had not expected, while the man who had abandoned it went to live in France with the woman he loved. That conviction helps explain why Wallis Simpson was never allowed to become ordinary family. The formal mechanism was cold and precise. On 28 May 1937, George VI issued letters patent ruling that Edward's future wife wouldn't receive the style Her Royal Highness. Edward retained HRH. Wallis became Her Grace, the Duchess of Windsor. Elizabeth supported the decision, but she didn't issue the letters patent. The king did. The government, courtiers, Queen Mary, and the wider royal household all shaped the settlement. What Elizabeth contributed was the emotional endurance to hold the position for decades. This distinction matters because the story is sometimes simplified into a single villain controlling a court. The machinery involved many people. Elizabeth was its most visible and consistent enforcer. Wallis and Edward married in France on 3 June 1937. They lived much of their married life abroad, especially in Paris. Their access to Britain and to the royal family remained limited and managed. They weren't fully restored to normal royal standing during Elizabeth's lifetime, not during the abdication's aftermath, not during the war, not when Edward fell ill and Elizabeth finally visited his deathbed, and not in the years Wallis survived him after 1972. Accounts repeatedly report that Elizabeth called Wallis that woman. The phrase appears in biographies and in the title of Anne Seba's Wallis Simpson study. It isn't an official statement, and no transcript records Elizabeth using it in public, but it persisted because it described the relationship accurately enough. Wallis was treated not as a sister-in-law, but as a permanent intruder who couldn't be recognized without validating the injury of 1936. Elizabeth reportedly also described Wallis and Hitler as the two people who gave her the most trouble. The phrase appears in secondary accounts rather than a published primary letter, but its circulation says something itself about how strongly the hostility registered to those who knew her. One famous story says Wallis attempted to greet Elizabeth at a dinner, and Elizabeth passed her with the words, "I came to dine with the king." The date, location, witnesses, and exact wording vary from account to account. It can't be treated as a settled record. Biographer Hugo Vickers, who knew the Queen Mother personally, reportedly pushed back against the idea that hatred was even the right word. His reported argument was that Elizabeth considered Wallis an adventuress, not someone important enough to hate. He quoted her as saying, "They said I hated her. It's not true. You have to know someone to hate them." The Duke of Grafton wrote that she never said anything nasty about the Duchess of Windsor, except to say she really hadn't got a clue what she was dealing with. The more devastating portrait may actually be the cooler one. Sustained contempt is more exhausting than sustained indifference. The implication of the Vickers account is that Wallis was denied full recognition not even out of hatred, but out of the considered judgment that she had not earned it. A royal family can punish without shouting. It can deny an invitation, refuse an introduction, withhold a title, or simply make one person impossible to acknowledge. In a system built on ceremony, access is currency. Wallis was kept in a currency-free zone for the rest of her life, and the woman most credited with maintaining that condition outlived Edward, Wallis, and nearly every witness who might have remembered the dinner anecdote. What Wallis experienced for decades wasn't a feud. It was something harder to fight. She was treated as a category of problem, not quite a person in the family's formal sense. But the same queen who could sustain that social distance became, during the Second World War, one of Britain's strongest public symbols. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, ministers suggested that Elizabeth and her daughters should be sent to Canada or North America. She refused. The wording has been reported in several forms, but the core statement stayed consistent. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." The princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, spent much of the war at Windsor Castle, about 20 miles west of central London, where air raid shelters had been prepared in the castle's basement. The King and Queen remained at Buckingham Palace during the day and often traveled to Windsor for the night. That arrangement didn't make their danger imaginary. Buckingham Palace was bombed on 13 September 1940, while George VI and Elizabeth were in residence. They weren't injured. The palace was hit again during the Blitz. Windows shattered, rooms were closed, staff left for military service. After the palace attack, Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the face." It was an extraordinary line because it understood the politics of risk. The East End had been hit repeatedly. Its civilians had sheltered in underground stations and damaged homes. For a queen to visit bombed districts in expensive clothes, while her own palace had not been touched, would have looked like observation from a safe distance. Once the palace was struck, she believed the king and queen had earned a different kind of standing. The East End visits weren't universally welcomed. Elizabeth explained this directly. She reasoned that if people came to see her, they would wear their best clothes, so she should reciprocate in kind. Norman Hartnell dressed her in gentle colors, avoiding black to represent what he called the rainbow of hope. The crowd hostility is a detail the wartime legend frequently omits. She wasn't uniformly welcomed as a beloved presence in bombed streets. She was sometimes resented as an expensively dressed visitor to suffering that wasn't hers to share. They visited bombed neighborhoods, hospitals, factories, military bases, and ships. The Imperial War Museums records that factory visits improved morale and production. Elizabeth and George VI gave Britain a visual image of continuity when continuity was under attack. The reported claim that Hitler called Elizabeth the most dangerous woman in Europe became part of the wartime legend. French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier offered a rather different private verdict. He reportedly described her as an excessively ambitious young woman who would be ready to sacrifice every other country in the world so that she may remain queen. Neither judgment is the whole picture. Both suggest that behind the gentle public performance, informed observers saw something considerably harder. Elizabeth didn't share the Blitz in exactly the same way as ordinary Londoners. She faced real danger, then returned to a protected system that most Londoners could never access. That was the pattern. The public image was true, but incomplete. We've seen the courage she earned and the insulation that qualified it. Now for the part of her story that the obituaries most reliably skipped. The deepest challenge to the Queen Mum image came from two women who had almost no public image at all. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was born in 1919. Her sister Catherine was born in 1926. Their father, John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, known as Jock, was Elizabeth's elder brother. That made Nerissa and Catherine the Queen Mother's nieces and Queen Elizabeth II's first cousins. In June 1941, Nerissa was 22 and Catherine was 15 when they entered the Royal Earlswood Institution in Redhill, Surrey. They were placed there on the same day, alongside three of their maternal cousins, Idonia, Rosemary, and Etheldreda Fane, daughters of Fenella's sister Harriet, who had similar disabilities. All five were committed together, and it was their maternal grandfather, Charles Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis, who funded their initial placement. Earlswood wasn't a temporary medical ward. It was a long-stay residential institution for people with learning and developmental disabilities. Its 19th-century name had been the Asylum for Idiots. Contemporary records used terms like imbecile and estimated the sisters' mental age at between 3 and 6. Those terms were the medical language of the period, and they reveal the kind of society that built institutions like Earlswood rather than building something better. Fenella Bowes-Lyon was widowed in 1930 when Jock died. After spending years in Paris, she had returned to Britain by the mid-1930s. There is evidence she and Harriet continued visiting their daughters at Earlswood for as long as they were able. When Fenella died in 1966, regular family contact appears to have stopped. The sisters' mother was the person most directly responsible for their lives after Jock's death. The Queen Mother was their aunt by marriage, separated from the immediate decision by distance and family structure. But the story didn't stay contained within those lines. Burke's Peerage, the aristocratic reference authority, listed Nerissa as having died in 1940 and Catherine as having died in 1961. Nerissa was alive until 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. Burke's editor, Harold Brooks Baker, explained how the entries came to exist. Any information given to us by the royal family is accepted. Even if we had evidence to the contrary, we would put in any information given to us by any member of the royal family. So a living woman had been entered into the aristocratic record as dead, and the record had been trusted and reproduced because the source was royal. Lord Clinton, a grandson of Harriet Fane, later denied any deliberate conspiracy, suggesting that Fenella had been a vague woman who had either filled out the relevant forms incorrectly or, more likely, not filled them out at all. The family's formal position was confusion and oversight. The Burke's editor suggested something different, that royal family-supplied information was simply accepted without verification, and that the publisher wouldn't correct information even with evidence to the contrary. Nerissa died on 22 January 1986, after approximately 45 years at Earlswood. Reports later said her grave was initially marked by a plastic tag bearing a serial number rather than a name, and that no royal family member attended her funeral. Those details come from press reconstruction rather than surviving cemetery documents, and they should be understood as reported rather than certified. In 1987, a tabloid journalist from The Sun visited Earlswood posing as a relative. He met and photographed Catherine. The story was published under the headline, "Queen's Cousin Locked in Madhouse." The language the press used, calling Catherine a lunatic, tells us as much about 1987 journalism as it does about the women themselves. But the underlying facts provoked a genuine public reckoning. A spokesman for Lord Strathmore, the Queen Mother's nephew and head of the Bowes-Lyon family, said of the institutionalization, "The whole thing is news to us." That statement was in keeping with the position taken by nearly every Bowes-Lyon family member, most of whom said they had been led to believe Nerissa and Catherine were dead. Lord Clinton's statement was the exception. "I have known for some time about the whole business," he said. "It's a family matter." So the family wasn't uniformly ignorant. Within the same extended family, some knew and some claimed not to know. The question of how far the knowledge extended, how far up the social hierarchy it had traveled, remained contested. Reportedly, in 1982, volunteers at Earlswood wrote to the Queen Mother, informing her that her nieces were still alive. She reportedly sent money for toys and sweets, but didn't visit. By the time the press had the story in 1987, 5 years had passed, and no further request for money had come, nor had any acknowledgement. She didn't visit. That same year, Nerissa died, 1986, the Queen Mother became a patron of MenCap, the UK charity for people with learning disabilities. MenCap's own Secretary-General later summarized the charity's historic guidance to families with disabled relatives as, "Put them away and forget about them." The patronage wasn't cynical in isolation. She supported hundreds of organizations across a long public life, but the timing creates a particular discomfort. In the year her niece died after 45 years in institutional care, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became a patron of the organization whose own past advice had made Earlswood's existence possible. When Earlswood closed in 1996, the hospital administrator later claimed that neither the Queen nor the Queen Mother would agree to meet to discuss Catherine's future care. The administrator wanted to involve the family in planning the transition. The family's position, as it had been since 1987, was that this was a private matter for the Bowes-Lyons. Historian Gareth Russell, writing about the Queen Mother in his biography, Do Let's Have Another Drink, argued there was no evidence Elizabeth participated in the 1941 admission decision, and that she sent money after learning the sisters were alive. His account treats her culpability as bounded, and her later response as genuine, if insufficient. The sisters' story isn't proof of a one-woman conspiracy. It's evidence of a system in which class, disability, family privacy, peerage publishers, medical institutions, and royal silence could work together to make a person socially invisible without anyone issuing a single dramatic order. The aristocratic families of this period routinely didn't discuss disabled relatives publicly. The medical guidance of the era told families to institutionalize and move on. Peerage publishers accepted family-supplied information without verification. The royal family treated it as a private matter. The press, for decades, never found the story. The result was still devastating. Nerissa and Catherine weren't hidden behind a castle wall. They were hidden by paperwork, distance, euphemism, and a culture that treated disappearance as a form of family care. That same culture shaped everything Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon understood about class and conduct. In a private letter written after the first Labour government took office in January 1924, she reportedly described herself as extremely anti-Labour. She described Labour supporters as far removed from fairies and owls and bluebells and Americans and all the things I like. During post-war austerity, she reportedly wrote to George VI, "Oh, how I hate utility and austerity, don't you?" In 1947, a letter described Attlee's high hopes of a socialist heaven on earth as fading, referring to those who voted Labour as poor people, so many half-educated and bemused. I do love them. That last phrase is doing more work than it appears to. She did love them, in the sense that she could perform warmth for working people, visit their factories, and smile at their children. But they were poor and bemused in her private language. People who had made a misguided political choice that an educated aristocrat might gently correct through continued example. Woodrow Wyatt later recalled her saying, "I hate this classlessness thing. It's so unreal." It was unreal to her because she had never been asked to live without class. Classlessness is only unreal from inside the system that benefits from class. George VI's private secretary was reportedly asked to define her political philosophy. He offered the former verse of All Things Bright and Beautiful. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them, high or lowly, and ordered their estate. That verse is no longer sung in most Anglican churches. The worldview it describes shaped Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's sense of what order looked like and why it mattered. In private, her views could slip further. She reportedly told Wyatt she had some reservations about Jews. During the 1947 royal tour of South Africa, she apparently struck an enthusiastic admirer with her umbrella after mistaking his enthusiasm for hostility. A moment that passed briefly and was largely absorbed as an amusing anecdote. She opposed democratic elections in India. One of her ladies-in-waiting reportedly summarized her attitude toward African governance. "Poor darlings, the Africans just don't know how to govern themselves. It's just not their form." The wife of the British ambassador to France described her as rather mocking, not very kind. These attitudes don't erase the factory visits or the Blitz courage. They sit alongside them. The question the portrait demands is whether a woman can be genuinely brave in one direction and genuinely cruel in another. The answer, which the Queen Mother's life makes unusually visible, is yes. She could be warm to crowds at Glamis, inspiring to workers in bombed factories, and privately contemptuous of the political aspirations of those same people. Warmth and condescension weren't opposites in her worldview. They were both ways of managing the distance between her world and everyone else's. That management was most explicit in what happened to Marion Crawford. Crawford, known as Crawfie, had been governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret for 17 years from 1930. She knew their childhood routines, their schools, their moods, their family habits. After leaving royal service, she became involved in articles for the American Ladies' Home Journal and then published a memoir, The Little Princesses, in 1950. The royal family cut her off completely. Crawford's later papers included a letter attributed to the Queen Mother that contained two crucial elements, operating in opposite directions. The first was the demand. People in positions of confidence must be utterly oyster. The phrase wasn't a public doctrine. It was a private requirement that anyone who had lived inside the royal household keep what they knew sealed, regardless of their own interest or integrity. The second was the arrangement. The letter also referred to a Times journalist, Dermot Mora, who had been engaged to write pieces based on information supplied to him by Crawfie. This was fine, the letter suggested, as long as Crawford's name didn't appear. The palace had approved using Crawford's knowledge for American readership, for money, anonymously. When Crawford was eventually named in the articles and in the book, the response was total estrangement. Her husband had signed a contract with the Ladies' Home Journal and received $85,000. The palace considered this a betrayal. Crawford considered herself a victim of a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding, if it was one, cost her everything. Childless and separated in later life, Crawford attempted suicide twice, nearly succeeding in the late 1980s. She died alone in a nursing home. Her close friend, Nigel Astle, later said, "She always hoped for a reconciliation, but it never came." Crawfie was intensely loyal and wouldn't use the letters to defend herself, even though they showed she had been acting in good faith. The letters sat in a box for 50 years. Crawford protected the Queen Mother even while losing her own life to the aftermath of the Queen Mother's decision. This wasn't a private quarrel with a difficult former employee. It was a demonstration of what the price of broken confidence looked like, in a court that never needed to shout to make its displeasure fatal. Crawford could survive without being publicly denounced. She simply ceased to exist in the royal family's world. The Queen Mother's own private world, meanwhile, required substantial maintenance. By her last years, she received an annual civil list payment of £643,000. Reported household expenditure ran from £1 million to £2 million a year. She maintained several homes, including Clarence House, the Castle of May in the extreme northeast of Scotland, and Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. She employed a large staff, entertained lavishly with pages behind every chair at formal dinners, collected art, owned racehorses, and lived in the manner of an old aristocracy that had survived the age of rationing by simply not noticing it applied to them. When she died, press reconstructions reported a Coutts overdraft in the range of roughly £4 million to £7 million. No released ledger established a definitive final figure. The multi-million-pound scale, though, isn't in dispute. Queen Elizabeth II reportedly settled the liabilities after her mother's death. An inheritance tax arrangement from 1993 had exempted property passing from a former monarch's consort to the reigning monarch, which managed the legal exposure. The contrast is sharp. The nation's favorite grandmother, associated with wartime resilience and the decency of shared suffering, left debts measured in millions of pounds. That didn't make her unusual among wealthy people insulated from their own household bills. It did show how distant the public Queen Mum image was from the material reality of her private world. She had spent her public life as a symbol of the monarchy's connection to ordinary people, while privately running a lifestyle that required a perpetual subsidy from the crown just to sustain. Her drinking reputation belongs in the same category: vivid, persistent, but impossible to measure with clinical precision. Staff recollections described gin and Dubonnet before lunch, wine with lunch, port and a martini before dinner, and champagne at dinner. One later estimate suggested around 70 units a week. There are no clinical records establishing a diagnosis. What can be said is simpler. She enjoyed alcohol, racing, long lunches, house parties, and the privileges of rank without apparent concern for their cumulative cost. The cheerful, elderly figure who appeared at public events wasn't a frugal survivor of wartime Britain. She was a grand aristocrat who had outlived the world that formed her, and was spending money on that world's pleasures at a rate her official income couldn't cover. Her influence survived into a monarchy that had changed beyond recognition. By the 1990s, Diana, Princess of Wales, had become the opposite of the old royal method. She spoke about bulimia, loneliness, marital betrayal, depression, and the emotional cost of palace life. Her cooperation with Andrew Morton's 1992 biography and her November 1995 Panorama interview turned royal privacy into public material. Diana had told a friend as early as 1989, in a conversation later obtained by a tabloid, that the Queen Mother watched her with a strange look in her eyes. It's not hatred, it's sort of interest and pity mixed in one. By 1990, after the Queen Mother's 90th birthday party, Diana was describing the event as grim and stilted. They are all anti-me. My grandmother has done another good hatchet job on me. Diana's grandmother Ruth, Lady Fermoy, had been one of the Queen Mother's ladies-in-waiting since 1956. The Queen Mother and Diana's maternal grandmother had been connected for decades. Diana believed that connection was working against her. She also apparently felt the Queen Mother showed demonstrable favoritism toward William over Harry, to the point, according to biographer Gareth Russell, that Diana directly confronted her grandmother-in-law about it. The Queen Mother reportedly left Harry a larger financial share of her estate than William when she died, in a gesture that may have reflected a late awareness of the imbalance. After the confrontation, by Russell's account, relations between Diana and the Queen Mother deteriorated further, with the Queen Mother reportedly referring to Diana as a liar, and Diana responding by calling the aged Queen Mother the chief leper in the leper colony. That specific phrase, though widely repeated in biographical accounts, can't be confirmed from any primary recording or contemporaneous witness transcript. The settle-in recordings and the panorama materials don't contain it in the supplied evidence. The quarrel is documented. The exact language remains in the category of reported rather than verified. What the phrase communicates, whether Diana said it in those precise words or not, is the perception of a family controlled from a center that had already decided who was acceptable. The leper colony image suggests a place where people go to be managed and contained. Diana saw herself as someone who had been placed there, with the Queen Mother as the one who determined who belonged. When Diana died in Paris on 31 August 1997, that generational collision became a public crisis without precedent in the television age. The royal family remained at Balmoral with Princes William and Harry. William was 15 and Harry was 12. Their grandmother, their father, and their great-grandmother were trying to manage the children's grief in the most immediate terms. The decision to stay in Scotland was human in that immediate sense, but television audiences in London saw something else. They saw flowers piling outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace in the tens of thousands. They saw a flag protocol that left Buckingham Palace's flagpole bare. No Union flag had ever been flown there at half-mast for a private person, and protocol required a flag only when the monarch was in residence. The palace was empty, so no flag flew. The protocol was technically correct. Emotionally, it read as indifference. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was reportedly hugely upset by the criticism her daughter subsequently faced. Friends, including Sir Michael Oswald, described her anger and defensiveness at the public reaction. She had spent her own wartime years demonstrating that the right symbolic act at the right moment could change how an entire country felt. Now the opposite was happening. The symbolic absence was costing the monarchy's reputation in real time. No evidence proves that the Queen Mother personally directed the Balmoral decisions. The choices involved Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Charles, courtiers, advisors, and the protection of two grieving children. But the culture behind the response, the instinct to withdraw, to wait, to let formality answer emotion, was the culture Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had embodied for 60 years. It was the culture that had protected the monarchy after the abdication, the culture that had treated discretion as virtue, the culture that could withhold Wallis from recognition, turn Crawford into a non-person, allow disabled relatives to disappear behind institutional walls and false death dates, and maintain all of this without a public scene. In 1936, that approach had helped stabilize a constitutional crisis. During the Blitz, restraint had read as courage. In 1997, under live television coverage and the extraordinary public outpouring for Diana, silence read as arrogance. The monarchy adapted because it had no choice. On 5 September, 5 days after Diana's death, Queen Elizabeth II returned to London and delivered a televised address in front of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace. She spoke of Diana as a grandmother and as a queen. The speech came after days of mounting criticism because the old strategy had failed completely under the weight of public feeling. The utterly oyster instinct that had once protected the monarchy's mystique, keeping personal matters sealed, never explaining, never complaining publicly, had become legible to a television audience as coldness. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's own letters make clear she had always believed that position was correct. People in positions of confidence must be sealed. Royalty must not air its difficulties. The family story must be managed. What Diana demonstrated, and what 1997 made permanent, was that in a live media environment, managing the family story no longer meant controlling it. It meant being seen to control it. And being seen to control a story about death and grief looked, from the outside, like not caring. Elizabeth died less than 5 years later, on 30 March 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park. The official cause recorded was extreme old age. The Duke of Windsor is sometimes quoted as having privately described her as charming but shrewd, scheming, extremely ruthless, adding in the same breath that she couldn't be quoted. That verdict has circulated in biographies and commentary for decades. No original document, date, audience, recording, or complete wording has been established from the available evidence. It shouldn't be treated as his verified private judgment. Edward's hostility needs no unverified quotation to be understood. His relationship with Elizabeth was shaped entirely by the event that defined her life. He walked away from the throne and forced her husband onto it. She never separated Wallis from that injury. The formal machinery that kept Wallis outside was created by George VI and the royal establishment. Elizabeth was a prominent and enduring supporter of that exclusion. That is where the warm public image and the darker record converge most clearly. She placed her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior because war had taken her brother. She stood beside a frightened king who had never expected the crown. She refused evacuation during the Blitz. She remained at Buckingham Palace through bombing. She visited factories and ruined streets and gave Britain a visible symbol of shared resolve. Britain had reasons to love her. The 200,000 who filed through Westminster Hall and the million who lined the Windsor route were expressing something real. But she also lived within, and helped preserve, a system that could turn affection into propaganda and silence into punishment. Wallis Simpson was denied full recognition for decades, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the sustained application of etiquette, access, and absence. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon vanished from the public family record while they were still alive. Their deaths registered in the aristocratic literature years before they actually occurred. Marion Crawford lost the family she had served for 17 years after a publishing arrangement that the palace had originally permitted, and she carried that loss until her death, never quite able to believe it was final. A household supported by public funds accumulated an estimated multi-million-pound overdraft behind the cheerful exterior of a frugal wartime granny. Her legacy wasn't a secret evil hidden beneath a false public image. The two were more inseparable than that. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon understood that monarchy depends on what people can see: the bouquet, the bombed palace, the smile, the crowd, the funeral procession. She also understood the power of what they can't see: the missing invitation, the withheld title, the unvisited institution, the former governess who no longer exists in the family story, the cousins whom Burke's peerage listed as dead while they were still alive. For most of her life, that carefully managed invisibility made her seem dignified. By the time Diana died, the country had changed. Television had made silence visible in a new way. The old approach no longer read as restraint. It could read as indifference, and the distinction between the two had become the fault line on which the monarchy's credibility balanced. The institution that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon did more than almost anyone to shape and protect survived her by adapting to a world she had never believed required adaptation. At Westminster Abbey, the tomb of the unknown warrior still marks the spot where Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon stopped on 26 April 1923 and laid down her bouquet for Fergus, killed at Lewes 8 years before. The gesture was sincere, the grief behind it was real. And a woman capable of that kind of public grief was also capable of sustaining, across the length of a century, a system that could make other people, a divorced American, 2 disabled nieces, a trusted governess, disappear from the visible story without ever raising her voice to do it.